If you bring me to the beach, my higher power's there. I can't do what the waves do at East Matunic Beach in Rhode Island, these huge waves. And there's no wave machine that can do it, because if I go now to the Connecticut Sound in Connecticut, the waves are shit. I don't have any power over that, and I don't have any power handling those waves that are nasty and awesome at East Matunic. But I will tell you that sand being warm and the waves and the air and the smells and the wind, there is something there where I feel at peace, and many times it is the only place I feel at peace.
I'm Matt.
Hey, I'm Steve.
Hey, I'm John.
This is the Sober Friends Podcast. We're here for the sober curious, the new guy, and the old timer. We're here to talk about the stuff anyone looking to live alcohol-free has to face day to day, and how we overcame those struggles. We speak for no 12-step group, but we do try to remain anonymous. You're not alone. This is the Sober Friends Podcast.
Last night, Steve and I were at our Joe and Charlie. A reminder what a Joe and Charlie is, if you don't know. It's usually at somebody's home where we play these tapes of a big book study done by Joe and Charlie many years ago, where they talk about the big book and kind of bring it to life. I think it was called The Big Book Comes Alive. And we were in the We Agnostic portion. And I'd never heard this before, but Charlie talked about how in We Agnostic, alcoholics can never really be atheists. Why? Well, Charlie says that if you're really an atheist, then you're only doing it on your own will. So you have to be at least an agnostic, because then God just hasn't entered your life.
And I had to stop right here and see what is my belief as far as this God thing is concerned. And today we find there's only one of three ways that you can believe as far as God's concerned. One way is to be an atheist. Now, an atheist says there is no God. Therefore, they have no power greater than human power to turn to. The atheist would have to stand on their own 2 feet, run their own show. And I said, Charlie, are you an atheist? I said, no. I've always believed in some kind of God, so I'm not an atheist. I said, well, then maybe you're an agnostic. So I had to go to the dictionary and look that word up. And like Joe said, the word agnostic means without knowledge. An agnostic believes that there is a God. But since we've never tried to use God's power in our life, we've run our own show, stood on our own 2 feet. We've never received God's power, so we don't know that God exists. We believe in some kind of God, but we don't really know whether that's true or not. And I think that's what most of us are when we get here. Most of us get here with some belief in a God, but we have never turned to that God, and we've been running our own show and standing on our own 2 feet and doing our own thing. Even though we believed in God, we acted as if we did not believe in them.
And this chapped my ass. And I'd never heard it before. And it just, to me, this is where the more I learn about the big book and listen Joe and Charlie, I start to hear some things that tend to be contradictory. That there is this thought of a higher power greater than yourself. But Charlie's saying you can't be an atheist. So your higher power has to be God. And I just reject that. Religious God is not for me, for many, many reasons. But I don't believe in nothing. And I also believe you got to let go of self-will. So we can talk about this a bunch of different ways. I can go on a monologue, but I have you here, Steve. So I don't have to do that.
I don't know, Matt. Sometimes you going on a monologue is actually a good thing. But I agree with you. We both sort of felt the same way listening to that. And I think we both, and a lot of people in AA, no longer believe in that religious God that we may have been brought up with. So it's interesting. I don't know. there's a whole bunch of the big book that tells us we just need a higher power, right? It doesn't tell us we need a God. Although, again, we talked about it a little bit last night, and I mentioned it. It's, the big book was written by basically white Christian Protestant men, and these gentlemen, Joe and Charlie, are definitely Christian men.
Charlie was a Southern Baptist.
Right. Yeah, and I think they're probably both Southern Baptists,
Right.
or something. So
Joe is African American.
he is African American, right?
White as white can be.
But I'm Christian, I'm sure. And so anyway, so that's their point of view, where they're coming from. So I said last night, as much as they might say, okay, you don't have to believe this, like that's what they believe, and that's what they're coming with. So I definitely believe that you can be atheist and still work the program of AA. I mean, you just need a power greater than yourself, and I talk about it a lot. And right now, that power to me is something that's like the fellowship of AA in itself, and in particular, the people who I surround myself in AA. Like that's a group that's way more powerful than I am in all aspects of my life, not just my alcoholism, but if I have a life problem and I bring it to the group of people that I trust within AA, they will help me solve my life problem, right? So they are more powerful than me. And I do believe that's all you need to get sober. Now, most people, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't say that because I don't know the exact stats. But many people believe that some type of belief in a God type deity gives them comfort, gives them some stability, gives them some feeling that life isn't just worth nothing, right? Like there's a purpose, that something goes on, and that gives people a comfort to live by, and that's fine. I'm okay with that. And if that makes you a better person, then that's a good deal.
Yes.
What we're seeing a lot these days, and again, we start blurring that line of spirituality and religion, but we start seeing it on the religious aspect of that, is that's gone astray, right? It's gone astray, right? We see it certainly if you're listening to this and you live in the United States, we see it with the religious right. And, some other countries, if you're living outside of the United States, maybe you see it elsewhere. But yeah, it's gone astray. Like the people who should be fighting for things like the poor and all that don't seem to be. They actually seem to be fighting against those things. So kind of confusing to me. But that's one of the reasons why I've sort of moved away from that understanding.
Yeah, you're touching on something that wasn't really top of my mind. But some of the things that I see as hypocrisy in the religious world is a real turnoff to me.
Right.
I am not a believer that if there's a God, and because I didn't go to church, that's going to sentence me to an eternity of hell.
Right.
Seems like I'm being overpunished. But two, if I've got a legitimate issue with, I don't like the way some churches are being run, and legitimately there have been some great evils. There's been some great evils in the Baptist church and some great evils in the Catholic church. And that is just something that's coming to mind. Let's forget about Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker.
Right.
And people who have, there's a guy who turned the place where the Houston Rockets used to play basketball into a church. Should there be churches that are big enough to be a basketball stadium? Something feels wrong there. Now, this is not broad brushing every church, but I'm giving some examples there So if I look at that and say, that's not something I want to be a part of because I see corruption and I see hypocrisy there. These churches run by man. And yet you're still going to throw me into a pit of fire. It makes me feel like that's not a very good God.
Yeah. And again, that is a little bit off, what we started with, but it's part of it, I think, for a lot of us.
It gets to my root cause.
Right. Me too. And that's what I mean. Me too. It does get to my root cause. And I won't get into it. I don't want to, that's a rabbit hole we can go down to a different time. But if we get back to what we sort of started on, it's, and again, that was the push for me. The same thing was the push for me, seeing some of that stuff and going, this doesn't make sense to me, right? It doesn't make sense to me. And the other thing, I'll try to put a pin in it with this, but one of the things I've seen on social media is some of these agnostics and atheist people talking, and when you talk about, you said you didn't go to church, therefore you should be punished, right? They talk about infinite punishment, such as being cast into hell for eternity, for finite crimes, right? Right. So because you did something as a human, which is finite and has an endpoint, you're going to spend an infinite amount of time, in hell, which just doesn't make sense. So again, when I start looking at it that way, that pushes me away, and I go, okay, well then what is this God thing? What is this higher power thing, right? That's the question I started to ask myself. Well, if that doesn't make sense to me anymore, then what does make sense? And the truth is, I haven't come up with anything that makes sense to me. Now, here's the point, right? We're talking about it. I happen to know a lot of people now, right? Because I've started to talk about how, and I don't call myself an atheist. I actually call myself an agnostic that leans towards atheism. That's what I mean. That's what I say. Not completely there yet. And I share about that in meetings openly today. And what has happened was many people have come up to me and said, oh, I'm agnostic too. So now I have this group of people that know, and these are people with 30 plus years of sobriety. So you can be atheist or agnostic and get sober, because the fellowship is something. And that's the other thing. A lot of people put down the fellowship, and I agree that the fellowship is not the program. It's a different part of it. But the fellowship is important.
Yes.
Because at least from my point of view, and again, I know people who haven't done this, but you go through the steps, and then what happens? Well, I don't know. For me, that you go through the steps, and for me, that means I continue to work those steps in all aspects of my life. If I just went through the steps and thought, oh, I'm done now, or, yeah, I know how to go through the steps. If I need to, I'll go through them again, and then dropped away off from the fellowship, I'd be missing a huge, huge part of my sobriety. I say it all the time that I go to meetings to learn about myself, and I learn about myself by listening to other people. So I just think there's so much to it, because that's the other thing. And again, I love Joe and Charlie because they help me understand the program. And I don't want to sound like I'm putting them down. We've done a lot of Joe and Charlie's in our day.
Yes.
And but that's the other thing, is that they talk about, oh, you can't get sober in the fellowship. Well, the truth is, I know lots of people who got sober and stayed sober in the fellowship. Right? Our buddy Mike, who goes to the Monday night meeting, was 30 plus years of sobriety and never went through the steps until the last few years through COVID. He met a guy on Zoom. I mean, Mike had a lot of trust problems with telling his stuff to a local person, and he found somebody on Zoom that lived in a city far away from here. He felt comfortable with them. That person became his sponsor, and they have a great relationship now. But Mike stayed sober for 30 plus years without ever doing any of that work. So I've witnessed that you can do it. Would I recommend it? No. It's not a way that I would recommend.
He's the exception that proves the rule.
But it's possible. And I've taken plenty of guys through the steps who no longer attend meetings, and I see them on a regular basis, and they seem like they're living a happy, joyous life, and it seems to work for them. I don't think that'll work for me, personally. I really don't.
No, and if you don't have a fellowship, how are you going to work step 13?
Yeah.
You need the fellowship for that.
Yeah, right. You do need the fellowship for that.
I agree with you here on the fellowship that it is not one thing. The steps are a foundation.
Yep.
Regardless, I think the steps are really helpful. They're helpful even if you're not an alcoholic.
Yeah.
There's a lot in the steps that you can do that's going to help with your life. Here's where I find helpfulness in the fellowship. And it's a lot of what we're doing here. I'm not putting down Joe and Charlie, but it's good to question things, because if you can question things and it holds water, you're strengthening those things. Scientific method type stuff. What is good about the fellowship is it gives you a place to talk, and you can get differing opinions. You get a diversity of opinions.
Right.
And oftentimes you can hear what one person is saying, many people, that they may be saying a different thing, but it could be the same tip of the mountain. For instance, you could be in a case where you have 5 people who are all around a mountain, and they describe the mountain, and they describe something totally different, but it's the same mountain. It's the blind man. It's the 5 blind men who are all feeling an elephant, and they're giving a different description. They're all talking about the same animal, but they're doing it through a different perspective.
Yep.
And in the fellowship, you can get many different perspectives. Some of those things you may agree with, some of them you may not. Some of them you should consider even when you don't agree, and some of them you need to throw away because it's just wrong. But you're getting a different opinion on things from different people who have walked a different path. This is where it's helpful to not just go to a meeting where everybody's story is like you. It is good to have people who suffered a little bit, people who were homeless, people who are black, people who are white, people who are straight, people who are gay, of all types of diversity, because that path that they stepped through while they were drinking can help you with your sobriety, because you're going to hear different perspectives in different ways that alcoholism affected them. That is a big thing with the fellowship, of listen to those things, even when it's like, this does not relate to me. There was a guy who is newly sober and he went back out. That's not my story of relapse. And I hated hearing this guy's pain. It did not make me feel good. It is worth listening to the pain, because one, you start hearing that this story is not unique.
Right.
I've heard this 100 times. It's unique to him because he's experiencing it the first time, but not to me. And you start to hear what were the things that this guy did before he took a drink. And those things were similar. Even though it's a different path, the triggers were similar. It is worth me hearing that. I'm not thinking of taking a drink today, but I am. I'm not so bold as to say, well, what if I get into a bad situation? What if something goes topsy-turvy? Tomorrow's not promised for anybody. So I want to hear that. I want to hear what happened to see if there's something different, and listen to that. And like, is there anything in me like that I need to address? And that is very helpful in the fellowship if you're talking about a power greater than me.
Yeah, when I listen to people's stories these days, what I hear is almost always my story of how alcohol impacted me. Again, different varying levels, right? Different ways they got there. But in the end, right? I was unable to say no to that first drink. And even with that story Monday night that we heard, and it was difficult to listen to. It was difficult to listen to. And I pray and I hope that this person is able to learn from that, because if not, then things can get really bad very quickly. You know, I was talking about it on the way home with Mike. You know, so even though that relapse did happen to me, and my relapse was very much like his, right? It was sort of a plan. He wanted to be normal. And actually, the more thing, I hadn't even thought about it, really, till we started talking tonight. It was exactly like mine. I spoke about my relapse, right? Before I relapsed, I was hanging out in bars with people who are drinking, not often, but the famous one I remember is we were in Chicago. We had done a rehearsal dinner, you know, for my wife's son, downtown Chicago. We dropped a boatload of money on this whole wedding and this beer, and everybody was going out to listen to music. And at that time, I was drinking non-alcoholic beer, you know, making believe I was sober. And I went out and tried to make believe I was a normal person. And I'm not when it comes to alcohol. So I had convinced myself enough that I could do everything that these people could do. And sort of that's what the message was, right? I just wanted to feel like a normal person. And, you know, at one point I finally convinced myself that I could do that as a normal person, and had a few beers, and which kicked off the allergy. And this is what, you know, this is the part that Joe and Charlie does so well. They explained exactly what happened to me, right?
Yeah.
I was alcohol free, so I was able to keep that at bay. What I couldn't keep at bay was the obsession of having a drink. Finally, that kicked in, and then the allergy kicked in, and I was off and running. Like, I was just running again, because now my body was craving more alcohol. It's exactly what happened to me. And so that's what I'm saying. I'm not bad-mouthing Joe and Charlie. They've done a lot of stuff. I think they do a wonderful job helping you understand the fourth step and the fifth step. And then when you get into 8 and 9, all those things, I think they do a wonderful job. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. So I don't want anybody to think, oh, I don't want to do that because I heard on this podcast. It's worth doing it. This is probably my 9th time doing a Joe and Charlie in the last 14 years. Maybe even more than that. I don't even know. I've lost count of them. So as much as I don't love everything about it, I still think it brings a lot of value, especially to the newcomer.
Yes.
Right? And we have 2 in our group. We've gotten lucky. We've got 2 newcomers who are fairly new to sobriety. And I think it's very helpful to those, to people like that.
Joe and Charlie break down the big book in a very easy to understand way. I've done a little bit of studying because I'm a nerd, and I look at my role in sobriety can be as archivist, that I can have a role of being the scholar on this stuff. And I talked to Bill Shaberg, and he's a little on the stories Joe and Charlie have. Right. What Joe and Charlie do, if you go through, much like Bill, don't look at that big book as a history lesson, because Bill was not trying to do a history lesson. He's doing parables.
Right.
The Bill and Ebby story is not as it happened in the big book, but he didn't care, because his purpose was, I got to truncate and I got to help people get sober. So if I am fictionalizing a little bit to get to the greater good, then that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
And so what Joe and Charlie do is they really simplify things down so it's easier to understand, so that you can absorb this stuff. And then once you get to a point where you can really understand it, well, then go dive into writing the big book. But before then, even if you know a lot, you read that book, your eyes are going to pop out of your head.
Right.
That's a hard read.
Yep.
and it's good that we have scholarly stuff there. I am pointing out one little piece that caught my attention that I thought was, this is a good discussion topic.
Yep.
And that I don't agree with his whole idea of, well, you can't. And I think it's Joe and Charlie's way of saying, I don't want you to get hung up on atheism and not believing, so I'm going to gloss over it and I'm going to give you the on-ramp. And I also think the two of them have had a very strong faith.
Yeah.
My faith is otherwise. And I don't buy that whole, if you're an atheist, then you're running on self-will. I probably am more of an agnostic because I don't know. I don't know what is. But I know that the religion of my youth, the Catholic Church, going to church, doesn't work for me. I do know I feel something when I walk the dogs versus not walking the dogs. Other than the fact that a half hour ago, my kids were jumping up and down and making a ruckus above me, I know when the family's around. I was looking for my wife. The kids were quiet, but I was looking for my wife. Where's mom? I didn't know where she was. And I would have been surprised if they said she was upstairs. Turns out she was walking the dogs. There was an energy level that was lower because she wasn't here. Whatever it is, when people are in the house, when everybody's in the house, I feel something different. My dogs clearly feel something different because they notice when the car comes in before I do.
Absolutely.
They have some sense. When I go sit down at a certain time of day and I start to put my shoes on, it's not even like when I get the shoes. I don't know how they hear that I'm putting my shoes on, but that one dog comes, I start putting that shoe on and I hear what sounds like a drum roll getting closer to me of that one dog who I'm sure is going to somersault, ass over tea kettle down those stairs to get to me because we're going for a walk, aren't we? There is something that we as other living beings, I think, give off, that there is some type of energy. And John talked a lot about that last night because he is a First Nations guy, a spirit of the earth. And I am much closer to that. Right. If you bring me to the beach, my higher power is there. I can't do what the waves do at East Matunic Beach in Rhode Island, these huge waves. And there's no wave machine that can do it because if I go now to the Connecticut Sound in Connecticut, the waves are shit.
Right.
I don't have any power over that. And I don't have any power handling those waves that are nasty and awesome at East Matunic. But I will tell you that sand being warm and the waves and the air and the smells and the wind, there is something there where I feel at peace. And many times it is the only place I feel at peace. So I can't put my finger on what my higher power is because I can't wrap my head around it. But I know that there's something to do with energy at certain places on this planet. Stronger in others than not, and stronger when people are around than when not. And I also think I need a break from that energy sometimes because I do get my energy being alone sometimes. Sometimes I need that break. But not healthy to be not around it all the time. So I would say there's a higher power in the fellowship. I'd say there's higher power in fellowship, not only the fellowship. There's something that you've got to tap into for the right reasons.
No, I absolutely agree that there's some type of energy around. I mean, I've been talking about it a lot lately in my meetings, probably even on here. I never remember exactly what I've said, but I find it when I go out into the woods, when I go hiking. And lately I've been doing a lot of solo hiking, which I've never done. I've started hiking. I've been hiking really seriously with the guys for about maybe 7 years. Yeah, 8 years. I guess going on 8 years. And just recently started really venturing off doing what I would consider hikes on my own. Like I've certainly done walks in the woods and stuff like that. And I just find something different about that. I find something special. I find something calming. I find something peaceful. I've gone out on small hikes when I've been in a really, really bad spot. And by the time I get done with that, I find that I'm really in a good spot, which sounds to me a little bit like praying, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talk about when you're in a bad spot and you don't know what to do, pray on it, pray on it, pray on it. It seems to me like that's what happens to me, right? That's my type of connection. When I get out in the woods, something happens and I calm down and I'm like, oh, everything's going to be okay, right? Again, maybe not everything's the way I want it, but it'll be okay. So I feel there is that energy out there. I've always felt that there's a connection between humankind and the rest of the earth, right? That's why I'm somewhat an environmentalist. I do a lot of, things like recycling and as much as I can to sort of take care of the earth the best that I can. Because I feel like there's a connection. Like, I need to take care of this stuff. It's not separate from me. It's part of me. So, and again, I don't understand it. So, yeah, that's why I call myself an agnostic more than an atheist. But, for me personally, I'm almost 67 years old. I can't say that I've ever seen anything that really shows me any proof that there's a God. I can believe that there's a God, but I haven't seen any, or nobody's told me of anything that sounds like real proof that there's a God. And, there's a lot of things, like I said, that you hear people out there. If there's a God, the first thing I'm going to ask them is, Ricky Gervais says it. If there's a God, the first thing I'm going to ask him is, why does he make chocolate kill dogs? Right? Like simple things like that, right? Like, why did you make chocolate kill dogs? And, but it's those type of questions, like, why is that like that? So, again, a little bit of a tangent there, but like I said, if you haven't done Joe and Charlie's, please do yourself a favor. Find a good group of people. Sit down, do it. They're available. If you're a 12-stepper, if you're interested in knowing more, one of the things I've talked about, there's a group of ladies who are going to do it, and I told them I would pass on the information that we use, and they were very grateful for it. And I brought that up to John because the stuff I got from John, and it's nice to be able to pass that on, right? To have another group start doing that, and maybe it'll blossom out to more groups, and hopefully they'll get something out of it. Like for the last, like I said, 9-10 years that I've gotten out of it.
Joe and Charlie's are great just because they're usually small groups and you get to know people better. You have that intimacy. Yeah. You may not agree with what we had to say, and I'm not looking for everybody to agree what we have to say, just like I don't agree with everything Joe and Charlie have to say. And I'd love to hear what you agree with and what you don't agree with, because I want to learn and I want to get better. My email is matt@soberfriendspod.com. On TikTok, Instagram, and Blue Sky, you can find the show @SoberFriendsPod. Steve, thanks for another thought-provoking episode.
You're welcome, Matt. Nice seeing you.
Yeah, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody. Very nice.